So Thanksgiving, 1994. Hard to believe it was 20 years ago. See, before Thanksgiving 1994, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. But starting with Thanksgiving 1994, it hasn't been. See, my family tradition was we'd always go to my grandfather's house for Thanksgiving. Big family, a lot of food, a lot of fellowship. 1993 Thanksgiving was the last time we ever did it. My grandfather fell shortly after that Thanksgiving. He was in the hospital, in a nursing home. Never got back out. Passed away before Thanksgiving 1994. To compound things, Thanksgiving 1994, I decided I didn't want to be with the family because that was too tough. So I decided, let's go with my friends in college and hang out with them for Thanksgiving 1994. That resulted waking up in jail Thanksgiving morning, 1994. I don't remember much of what happened the night before, but I remember waking up in jail. I remember eventually getting out of jail. I remember hiding that from my family for a long time. Since then, I have bad memories of Thanksgiving. I don't enjoy Thanksgiving. I wish I could, but I don't. You see, when I was sitting there in the jail cell, I realized that spiritually, I was lost. Spiritually, I was a wee little man. Heavenly Father, I ask that you send your Spirit to be with me today. Give me the words. Touch my mind and my heart. Help me to say your words, Lord, not mine. Just ask that you be with this church. Be with those who are traveling, who are missing. Be with those that are visiting. Just ask that you be here with us, Lord. In your Son's name. Amen. Today's sermon and next week's sermon is about another wee little man, Zacchaeus. And I always thought it was funny that as a child, you'd always hear the story of Zacchaeus. But after you left children's Sabbath school, for me it was Sunday school, after you left the children's division, you never really hear about Zacchaeus again. And it was several years ago I found a book on the life of Zacchaeus. And it made me think more about it and made me start contemplating that there's a lot there that we are missing by leaving it in the children's school. Oh, maybe I'm not controlling it. There we go. How many of you remember the song? I'm not going to say it, don't worry. I want you to stay to the end of it. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the master passed that way, he looked up in the tree. And he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. There were even some hand symbols. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the hand gestures. It's been a long time. But that's really all that most of us ever remember about Zacchaeus. Because that's all they ever really taught us. And the only thing I do remember is that something about when Jesus looks up at Zacchaeus, he does something like this with his hand. Kind of like a no, Zacchaeus. But I want to to dive into this story of Zacchaeus the next 2 weeks and really figure out what it's all about and not just a cute little song. You see, Zacchaeus is found in the book of Luke 19 and verse 1. That's where it starts. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. In order to really talk about this story, we need to get a little bit of background. Because we really need to know what was going on. First of all, this story is, again, only found in the book of Luke, which I found interesting, that it was only found in one of the Gospels. If you remember, the book of Luke was written specifically to the Gentiles. And it made me wonder, well, why is it only in this book? Why was it not in any of the other Gospels? Because this story reaches out to the Gentiles. It reaches out, even though Zacchaeus wasn't a Gentile, he was a Jew, but he was an outsider. The story is really about that trying to reach out to a Gentile. So Luke is the only one who included it in the Gospel. It's also interesting to note that as Jesus entered Jericho, he was only a couple of days away from being crucified. He's on his last entrance into Jerusalem to be crucified. His time is almost done. So as you hear this story, continue to think that this is Jesus knowing what he is going to in a few short days, but realizing that one person mattered. The city of Jericho, as far as we know, this is really the only time Jesus ever went to the city of Jericho. But the city of Jericho, most of you may remember the Old Testament story about when Joshua and the Israelites marched around Jericho and they blew the trumpets and the walls came tumbling down. Soon, they never rebuilt that Jericho, but they rebuilt the city of Jericho nearby and added this city. You see, Jericho was a very important city. It was on the trade route from north and south, and east and west. If you wanted to go anywhere in that land, you had to go through Jericho. As such, it was very important for trade, for finances. It was a very rich city, monetarily. And you see Zacchaeus, in biblical times, a person's name means a lot more than what it means now. Zacchaeus means the pure one, the righteous. If you ask those in Jericho, they probably wouldn't agree with his name, because he didn't quite seem like the pure one or the righteous to them. We meet Zacchaeus in 19 verse 2. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. So what do we learn from Zacchaeus? One, tax collectors, interestingly enough, did not have a salary. There's no salary for being a tax collector back then. You had to go to Rome and you had to say, I would like to be the tax collector for that city. And it was kind of like the lowest bidder, highest bidder won. So he had to go to the Romans and try and become a tax collector to get that bid. And what ultimately happens, the Romans will say, for the city of Jericho, you need to bring in X amount of dollars. And his salary came from anything over and above X amount of dollars. So it was in the very nature of his job to scam people, to get more. If he had to get $10 from this person in order to meet his quota, well, if he got $30, he just made $20. So the very nature of the business was that he needed to cheat people. We often think of the tax collectors as being, I know we don't have any tax collectors out here. But I'm a lawyer, so it definitely has. We're all. Not only was he just a tax collector, but he was the chief tax collector. He was the head guy. He had tax collectors below him. So it's kind of like a pyramid scheme. Not only does he get a percentage, he gets a percentage of the people below him. So you can imagine Zacchaeus in Jericho. He was the most hated man in the city. Nobody likes a tax collector, but they hated even more at that time because to be a tax collector, you had to be in bed, so to say, with the Romans. He was viewed as a traitor. He was viewed as unclean. He wasn't even allowed to go into the synagogue as a tax collector. But at the same time, being the chief tax collector, he had a lot of power in that city. He was a man of influence. He was probably the richest man in the entire city. The biggest house, the best possessions, the best clothes. He was a big man in town, even though he was a wee little man. Ever heard of the Napoleon complex? Perhaps he got there. Perhaps he wanted to be that chief tax collector to make up for his other shortcomings. Fact of the matter is, he had everything you could want. He had possessions, he had power, he had everything. But he realized it wasn't enough. Even though he had everything, he was lonely. Nobody liked him. 19:3 says, he, meaning Zacchaeus, wanted to see Jesus, who Jesus was. But being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. As I said, he had everything. But it wasn't enough. He was lonely. And you know what? He had heard about this guy named Jesus. He had heard about that Jesus didn't care who you were. That he had had lunch with sinners and tax collectors before. In fact, one of his disciples was even a tax collector. He had heard about all the miracles and the healings, and he realized that he had a hole in his heart. He had everything money could buy, but he still had a big old hole in his heart that couldn't be filled. And he hoped that maybe this Jesus might be able to fill that hole. All he wanted to do was to see him. And it made me think that as being one of the most powerful men in the city of Jericho, couldn't he have demanded an audience? Couldn't he have demanded a front row seat? He could have bought people off, left me up front. But he didn't do any of that. He didn't use his power, influence, and money to try and see Jesus. See, the change is starting to occur in Zacchaeus' life. He sees that there's only so much that money and power and influence can do. So he tried to see him on his own, without any of that other stuff. He tried to get close, but the people of Jericho wouldn't allow him. Could you really blame them? He was a traitor. The guy that they all hated, that was stealing from them, trying to get up close. I can imagine them taking advantage of the situation. A crowd, he won't know who's doing this. I see them pushing, shoving, kicking, punching, not to let him anywhere near the front. A little bit of revenge for them. Zacchaeus could have done several things at that point. He could have just flat out given up and said, you know what, I tried, didn't work. I'm going to go back on that. Wallow in my self-pity. Wallow that I have all this money but no friends. He could have given up. We do that a lot, don't we? When times get tough, we give up. We think it's never going to get better, and we give up. But Zacchaeus didn't do that. Verse 4. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Rich people, dignified people, they don't run. You ever notice that? And again, this is Zacchaeus, the richest person in town with the best clothes. Armani suit, I don't know what women wear. Armani suits might not be that expensive either. I don't know, I don't buy that stuff. The best clothes. Can you imagine seeing somebody wearing a Vera Wang, I don't know this stuff, wearing something like that, running down the street? It doesn't happen. Dignified, rich people don't run. But you know who does? A desperate person. A desperate person will run. Rich, dignified people also don't climb trees. And we have a lot of our children in here today. How many people under the age of 15 have climbed a tree within the last year? Let me see your hands. If you're under the age of 15, how many of you have climbed a tree? See quite a few hands. Now, if you're over the age of 25, how many of you have climbed a tree within the last year? Not nearly as many. A couple. And that's good. Why don't we climb trees anymore? It's dangerous. I think nothing is. It can be very dangerous. I'm afraid of heights. Got me there. That'd be a short tree. But when we become adults, we don't climb trees because, we're grown-ups now. We shouldn't do stuff like that. Dignified people don't climb trees. And again, here's Zacchaeus in his best clothes, climbing a tree. Again, rich, dignified people don't climb trees, but who does? The desperate. Desperate people will climb a tree if they have to. Perhaps us adults need to put our trust into Jesus and forget about what society says is appropriate and go back to being a little bit more like our children and do what Zacchaeus did. See, one of the things that separates ordinary people from extraordinary people is the spirit of passion. That sense of inner drive and purpose, the ability to stay focused on a target with dogged tenacity. It's that thing that you have when you're doing something you believe you're meant to do, that you're born to do. The sense of urgency that makes you move forward when all other signs are pointing backwards. You see, for Zacchaeus, all signs were pointing on, this isn't going to work out. I should just go home. All the signs were pointing to retreating, to giving up. But he ran ahead of the crowd and acted like a desperate man and climbed a tree. You see, he was on a mission. He didn't care what others thought of him. Nothing was going to stop him. See, when your goal is set on Jesus, don't focus on what the crowd says, or how the crowd reacts. Focus on Jesus. See, I am often the greatest obstacle to my seeing Jesus. We are the biggest obstacle in meeting Jesus. Zacchaeus should have given up. I probably would have. But he didn't. But truth of the matter is, whenever we focus on making decisions that will change our lives positively, the enemy will almost always emerge with weapons that impede our progress. Like excuses, procrastination, apathy, friends will throw water on the fire and will put up roadblocks in our path. Certainly happened that way with Zacchaeus. The crowd wouldn't let him near, so he had to run and find a tree. So what's blocking your path? What is it that's blocking you from seeing Jesus, having that relationship with Jesus? I know that since we planted this church, there's been a lot of roadblocks. Both for us as a church and for me personally. There have been times that I didn't necessarily feel like being here because things weren't going the way I wanted them to go. What I had to keep doing, I had to keep focusing on the mission and on seeing Jesus. And there ought to be something in our lives that we are so passionate about. Something that so moves us and inspires us that we're willing to risk everything. Willing to risk our reputations, our friendships, even our lives to fulfill. So I ask you, what are you passionate about? For a long time, my passion was work. I was a workaholic. And eventually I came to the conclusion, when I die, I don't get to take that with me. My passion is here, reaching people for Christ. Amen. See, life will always be meaningless without a passion for God. Zacchaeus had everything, but none of it could fill that hole in his heart. Only Jesus could do that. And another lesson learned from Zacchaeus is that you'll never get to where you need to be if you choose to remain where you are. If you stand still, you're never going to get further ahead. You see, Zacchaeus could have stood there thinking, I wonder if I'm going to grow. If I grow a couple more inches, I might be able to see over the crowd. Or he could have waited for the crowd to open up and he could get in. He could have stayed where he was with the crowd, hoping that he might be able to catch a glimpse of Jesus. But he didn't. He ran ahead. He planned. You need to do the same. If there's a roadblock where you're at right now to keep you from what you're passionate about, find a way around it. Run ahead and try and figure out where Jesus wants you to be and meet him there. One of the tough things that I can imagine for Zacchaeus is that when he got to that tree and he climbed that tree and he did all those things that dignified people didn't do, he then had to wait in the tree for the crowd to catch up. We're not very good at waiting. We are a society based upon cell phones and internet, and we want things done now. Kind of makes me miss the days of 14.4 dial-up. The young kids don't know what that is. When you had to use your phone line, and not a cell phone line, an actual hard phone line to get onto the internet. You had to unplug the phone, pull it out of the phone, and plug it into your computer. And you got this god-awful noise of trying to reach into the internet. And it was slow as molasses. But you were happy. Because eventually, that song in 10 or 15 minutes might download. Might, if you don't lose connection. And then nobody can call the house either while you're on the internet. The wait. Some of the best lessons I've ever learned was when God told me to wait. You know, I can imagine what took place when that crowd made it to the tree. Because Zacchaeus is up in that tree. There he is, the rich chief tax collector in his nice clothes, up in a tree. I can imagine the citizens thinking, that guy's crazy. Chief tax collector, he just lost it. I don't know what's going on with him, but we need a new chief tax collector, is all I'm saying. Or probably ridiculed him, mocked him, much the same way that they did a short time later to Jesus when he was on the cross. You see, here at Trinidad Adventist Fellowship, we're a lay-led church. Nobody gets a salary here. There are a lot of people that might think we're crazy to do this. All the time, sweat, I don't know if any blood yet. Time and sweat and money that we've had to put in to get to where we are. To get nothing monetarily out of it. Financially, in a business sense, this is a horrible investment. All the money we put in to get nothing financially back out of it. People in the world probably look at us and think, those people are crazy. But like Zacchaeus, the world may think I'm crazy. The world may think that we are crazy. But like Zacchaeus, I don't care what the world thinks. Because at the end of the day, like Zacchaeus, all that really matters is seeing Jesus. So you have a wee little man up in a tree. You have a lost, spiritually wee little man in a jail cell. What changed him? What changed me? Same answer. Jesus. Only Jesus. Heavenly Father, I thank you for coming to this earth. I thank you for what you did a short time after that encounter with Zacchaeus. I thank you that you're willing to die for my sins, for his sins, for all of our sins. Thanksgiving may not mean the same to you anymore, Lord. But I know